thank you for the introduction. So, as Gordon said, I'm going to be talking about integrating more trees into Northumberland. And this is a project that I spent 3 months doing this summer, which, as you can probably imagine, was amazing to get to travel to all these different places across the county. And the reason I put more into the title is just to kind of remind us that there is a lot of trees in Northumberland and on farms. So, it's not an all or nothing, but I guess a bit of a gradient depending on the farmer and the land use. So first, I'll just give you the context and the aims of the project, the methods we used, and some of the key outcomes. So I thought maybe that everyone would need kind of a bit of a setting the scene when it comes to tree planting in the UK, in England, and then more specifically within Northumberland. So I think many of us will remember our previous general election when everyone was kind of competing. You know, I can plant 10 million trees, well, I can plant 12 million. And it really became something in the news and in the media that I think was quite new in this country around this, this movement to plant trees. So you can see that in the press release from DEFRA, 44.2 million pounds of funding for community forests. And then in Northumberland alone, 100,000. But it's not all kind of sunshine and roses. So you can see, I think this was from earlier this year, saying we'll miss the tree planting targets. And that's because obviously, like most things, it's very easy to say, we'll plant loads of trees. And then you come down to doing it and you realise that nothing is quite as simple as it sounds. Basically there is a big movement across the UK and in many parts of the world, and that's not only in policy and in the news, but also in research. So there's now a lot more research projects and government money and funding going into what kind of trees look like in our landscape. So that leads me to agroforestry, which is what I predominantly study. As I said earlier, I normally study this in Tanzania, but for this project I kind of moved over and studied it closer to home. And by agroforestry, I really mean integrating trees into farming systems. So that can kind of be a hedgerow or some individual trees or a row of apple trees next to some wheat and then another row of apple trees. And there's really increasing interest in agroforestry at the individual level, from organisations and from government, because it's kind of said to have all of these different benefits. So at the policy and at the larger scale, it can help us reach these really big tree targets that we're seeing. And then at more local level, it can benefit farmers, and it can also benefit society, so increases in biodiversity or carbon storage. So you can see in this diagram here, all of the kind of different benefits that people say agroforestry can bring you. So whether that's increasing soil carbon and fertility or preventing soil erosion, animal nutrition and welfare, because they can perhaps eat the trees or they can use them for shade and for shelter. Microclimate regulation, so I'm sure we've all gone and stood under the shade on a really hot day, and sometimes plants also need that shade, as do animals like cows, sheep. Human nutrition and mental health, so just things like the aesthetics of our landscape. People like seeing trees. A windbreaker, so a really good example of that would potentially be Storm Arwen, which I'm sure many of us will remember, that recently devastated the landscape, and we're still seeing, trees and forests blown over from that. And obviously carbon sequestration, so going to above national targets to global ones. And then this about the Agroforestry Elm Test Project was just to highlight that these are test projects funded by DEFRA to put agroforestry into the subsidies that farmers receive in this country. So it's really kind of a big talking topic. So when it comes to Northumberland, in terms of the scientific research, there isn't really very much, if not really any. So as I said, this was a 3-month pilot project, and we kind of set out to say, right, well, there's nothing on the topic, so let's start with the farmers, with the people that will be planting trees and implementing agroforestry, and see what they have to say on the matter. And then hopefully we can design more relevant and better research in the future from that. So we wanted to know, what extent do stakeholders see trees being part of the future of farming in Northumberland? What's driving the inclusion of trees in these visions? What barriers do farmers feel that they face when considering planting trees? And then how can policy and incentives support farmers that want to do this? So we did a few different methods. The first one we did was 14 visits to the farm. So these are very much farmer-led interviews. As you can see, it was a very small sample size of 14 farmers. So it was very much to get a very in-depth understanding of the context of their farm and what agroforestry or integrating trees means to them. So yeah, we had 2 women, 2 couples and 10 men, 8 owner-occupiers, 3 tenants, 3 farm or estate managers, 8 livestock, 3 mixed, 2 dairy and 1 arable farms. And I would say that's quite a good representation of Northumberland and then also the people interested. So as you can see, that was mostly livestock farmers, which does make sense for the county. So we also did 8 interviews with organisations to see how they considered themselves to be supporting farmers. So this would be things like the Woodland Trust, DEFRA, the Tenant Farmers Association. And then we held one workshop at the end of the project to type of bring this all together and hopefully allow farmers and other stakeholders to learn from each other and share their different views on the topic. So what were the key outcomes? So firstly, when we said, how do you see trees being part of your vision, that was very diverse and a very varied answer. And when we say to people, well, what is agroforestry? What do you think of it is in the context of your farm? We've pretty much got different answers from everyone we spoke to. So hedgerows was a big one, and this is putting trees along field borders. The next one would be, well, I see having trees as a way to divide up my fields. So many farmers that we spoke to were shifting to a style of grazing their animals called adaptive grazing. So this would be, say traditionally you have a really big field and you have your cows on that field for 6 months. This kind of new style of grazing is you have your livestock in a smaller area and then you say move them every month to another small area and another small area. And the reason that people do this is because it's supposed to help the soil and help the grass regenerate. So, yeah, the farmers we spoke to, many of them were considering moving to this different type of grazing system, and they saw trees as a way to divide the fields up into smaller packages and then also provide shelter for the livestock. So I think we will all remember not only Storm Arwen, in which case if there were animals outside they would probably be hiding under trees, but also this summer where there was drought and extreme heat, and I don't know if any of you were looking along the road, you'd often see the livestock hiding in the shade, and at least for me I was always feeling really bad for the cows that had nowhere to go and were just baking under the sun. And then parkland style, so this would be kind of sporadic trees within fields, and this was also quite common among farmers for aesthetic value, and also sometimes the animals can then eat the leaves once the trees are big enough. So many farmers saw integrating trees as their existing woodland. So this farmer, for example, had a lot of woodland on his farm, and he just wanted to know how he could manage that woodland better so that it has better benefits for himself as a farmer and for the biodiversity on his farm, or even creation of small patches of woodland on the farm. And this would often then link to perhaps existing subsidy schemes that the government has at the moment for tree planting. So often also farmers then would want riparian areas. So as you can see here, there's a river, but it's kind of patchy with trees. So many people were interested in enhancing the areas along their riverbanks, perhaps to decrease the soil erosion, because the roots can help stabilize the soil. And then linking to these kind of two was often about connectivity within the farm. So For example, one person said, I want to plant some woodland to connect this small existing patch to the riparian area I have. So farmers really saw connectivity for biodiversity benefits at the farm scale. And then a bit what I mentioned earlier, farm aesthetics. So at the end of the day, this is where people are living, and people want to live in a nice environment. So perhaps it's just planting trees because I don't want to see the farm building every day. I don't want to drive up my drive and see the farm building, I want to see trees. And then this I just put in just in case people are kind of unfamiliar with the different types that I just mentioned, so I thought maybe an aerial view would be more helpful. So you can see dividing fields in the corner, hedgerows, riparian planting woodland, and then the kind of sporadic trees, which is more like parkland style. So next we wanted to know what's driving the inclusion of trees for farmers. Why are these farmers suddenly interested in doing this? And I'd say the kind of overall grouping of the reasons people mentioned was really about maintaining and enhancing farm resilience. So what I mean by that is, making sure that their livelihoods can continue. And part of that is then the culture of farming that we have in this country and that people are very tied to. And then also environmental. So the farmers we spoke to, they're very concerned about the health of their soils, or they're interested in increasing the biodiversity around their farm. And they can see how that then links back to the productivity they get within their farming system. And so there were kind of 5 main things that people mentioned. The first one was diversification. So those who are kind of unfamiliar with UK farming, when we left the EU, we're now transitioning to a new subsidy system. And that means a decrease in subsidies for many, if not all, farmers. And so many people saw trees as a way to diversify. So maybe that would be they could get woodland planting grants from Forestry England, or just other ways they can diversify. Soils was a big one. So I would say most people were very interested in soil health and how trees can be used as a tool to enhance soil health. So obviously trees wouldn't be the complete answer, but that links a bit back to what I said earlier about the adaptive grazing that these farmers were wanting to move to. And then trees were seen as kind of part of that package. So at a farm scale, how can I improve the soils and therefore the productivity of the grass and then the livestock? And then trees were seen as a part of that. So livestock health and welfare was also a very big driving factor, particularly since, as I mentioned, Storm Arwen and the droughts that we saw this summer. And there's a lot of interest in livestock eating trees. So, for example, there's been some studies to show benefits that livestock that eat willow. And you can actually see this if you go to farms. Often you'll see where the sheep, because obviously they're smaller, so there'll kind of be a line at the hedge where the sheep have eaten all of the leaves, and then above it it's nice and green. So yeah, livestock health and livestock productivity was really a big driver of that. Linking back to the culture I mentioned a minute ago was farm history. So farming has changed in this country, of course, over the years, over the generations. But some people said, oh, well, I want to plant parkland because that's what used to be on this field. Or I want a woodland here because this is where the woodland used to be. I found some old maps, and so this is what I want to do here now. So it's just linking back to that culture of farming and having trees in the landscape. And then lastly, biodiversity benefits. So this really particularly linked to connectivity and how adding trees can maintain that connectivity at the farm scale. So whether that's linking up patches of woodland or increasing just general biodiversity benefits. Many farmers said that they saw an increase of birds when they had more trees on their farm after they'd planted. So obviously in this study it was very much more anecdotal evidence, but there is also scientific evidence about how trees can increase biodiversity on the farm, which just also goes to show how important local knowledge can be. So So these were just what I mentioned earlier. Just to add to the diversification, there was some interest in carbon credit schemes, which was also seen kind of as a way to diversify, to plug the income gap that will soon be coming for a lot of people. Some people said, absolutely not, I have no interest in carbon credits, I don't want that at all. And others said, if you're going to pay me, I'll do it, I need to keep my business alive. So completely fair argument. And just to note that often when trees were included in these visions, it was very much in marginal areas. So people would say, oh, well, I'm not really doing much with that land anyway, or it's not very productive, or the livestock don't like it, it gets very muddy. So maybe I can plant trees there and that can bring some other benefit to me and to my business. Just to add, for example, with livestock health, this really linked to many farmers in the current climate considering having less inputs and less costs of their farm. So the thought process was often, right, well, if I can have trees and there's more shelter for my livestock, then I don't have to bring them in as long during winter, and that can decrease my overwintering costs. So I've gone through these. What barriers do farmers face when integrating trees? As you can see in the picture, this was one farmer experimenting with different ways of livestock protection to reduce the costs. So fencing, as I'm sure many of you know, is not cheap. And you have obviously your livestock that will eat small trees, deer. So fencing and then the costs of the trees, but really the protection was a really big barrier that people felt was an issue. Also tree suitability and disease. So ash and elm is obviously a big problem. So many people really wanted to increase the diversity of what they were planting on their farm to try and increase this resilience of their farming landscape. And in the potential of climate change. So, I'm worried, what if I plant this now and in 50 years we're too hot or it's not suitable for this area anymore? And then I think the other big barrier is very much knowledge. So this relates to kind of all aspects of planting trees. What trees do I plant? Where to plant them? What tree guard is the best tree guard? And there's really a need for flexibility and context-specific knowledge, which often goes kind of against what the government schemes where they try to kind of fit you into a box of you must do this and this and this to get the subsidy. But actually sometimes we need this more flexible and very context-specificness on the ground. So, this was kind of 4 things that we said that policy and incentives could support farmers. So the first one, is funding, but really flexibility in funding. So allowing people to have lower densities of trees than are currently allowed on funding streams, for example. And like I said earlier, alternative sources of income. So can I look to private carbon markets or the private sector instead? Policy support. So tenant farmers, the situation is very different to if you own the land and you own the farm. If you're a tenant farmer and you plant a tree, who owns the tree? So actually, one of the most informative interviews we had was with the representative from the Tenant Farmers Association, discussing actually how kind of sometimes unrelated policies can be very beneficial for something like tree planting. And more information. So at the moment, there is a bit of a lack of information, we can say, on replacement schemes. And then where does that leave you when you're planning, particularly when you're planning for farming and trees, these things that are on much longer term timescales? Objectives. Farmers kind of sometimes have things coming at them from many different angles. So we want them to produce food, but we want them to be doing it in an environmentally nice way. And then particularly, for example, the war in Ukraine, there's now a larger emphasis on domestic food production. And so sometimes it's recognising that there will be trade-offs, and it is sometimes a lot to deal with on one farm to have all of these differing objectives. And yet knowledge. So making sure that knowledge is specific to the farm and that's long-term taking into account the history of the farm, the present and the future. So yeah, thank you, and any questions?